The film is political and personal, but let's begin with the political first. As a teacher of architecture, how has been this concern with architecture as autobiography? What has been your experience as a teacher of architecture? And so why did you then turn to film for it?
So one of the things, one of the things that I'm interested in about architecture is actually the way that architecture is always, in some sense, perpetually haunted. It's when you're designing it, it's haunted by the possible future presences who are going to live there. So when you're putting a bed here, you're like, oh, this is where somebody is going to live in the future, right? And of course, it's also the place that people leave traces, and then there's another kind of haunting that happens because of that. And really, my interest in architecture is there. It's in the way that presences are registered of possible futures and possible pasts, right? And the way that somehow when people are talking about architecture, very often it's not about those presences. It's the attention is largely on the artifact itself. And as somebody who teaches architecture, and I've really felt that a lot of films that are about architecture usually fall into the sort of hero architect format, the great architect, or it's usually the great heritage project. What a wonderful building it is. And the stories like that. And I felt like there was no there was a possibility in film to begin talking about architecture in perhaps different ways, maybe more like you put it. Philosophically or politically, or talking about the different resonances that are actually part of the architectural enterprise, but people very often don't necessarily pay too much attention to it, paying more attention to the visual or the tectonic qualities of buildings in themselves. So I think one of those, my interest in kind of using using film to talk about architecture is really to be able to, I guess, exercise those hosts, if you want to call it, in that sense. Yeah.
And you've collaborated before with Mukul, no? With
Yes.
both of you have worked on that. And in a way, there is I'm reminded of the earlier films because of the way you've used the films division footage and trying to build that connection with the nation building project and individual stories, no? So can you talk a little bit about that? The whole concern with using films division material?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, that's an archive that I've referred to and dipped into quite frequently, as you know. And over here, apart from the more illustrative material, there's also a reference to our previous film together, Nostalgia for the Future. So the moment the film turns very deeply personal when he's talking about his father, the shots that you're seeing are of the models of these houses, which are on a turntable, and which is directly referring back to that film, which was talking about an idea of modernity in architecture and everything that it meant, in terms of the architecture of the home, modernity in the nation and the architecture of the home at that point of time. And like you said, it's something that, I've been studying and also using a lot while teaching. Just different modes of recording and representing, and it's an archive, it's an institution which is very, very largely discredited as being entirely propagandist. A lot of that is true. But to dismiss it altogether, and dismiss all the work of creating that visual archive, a subjective archive, and it's not claiming to be anything else. It's something that, I've been interested in looking at.
And perhaps using it in another
and using it also.
way.
And then what happens while using it here is that your story immediately gets a backstory. It takes you back to the 50s, it takes you back to the 60s and the 70s and so on, And what happens in this film also, as it does in Nostalgia as well, is that along with the archival, there's also the cell phone archival, which introduces a different register of remembering.
Yeah.
So from, let's say, the national and what is supposedly more objective, to the deeply personal, and the degraded image of the cell phone video and the cell phone photograph creates these different sets, levels of experience of
Visual.
memory
Yeah.
and recording.
So then let's turn to the personal. So the thing that I noticed is that although it is talking of very deeply personal things, you to make a choice of talking about them in a slightly aslant way. Yeah? You've made a choice of not actually talking to your sister. Instead, there is the use of the voiceover, and also in the way that the voiceovers are written, right? They're not very direct. So I was wondering if you'll talk a little bit about, why that choice and what do you feel that brings to the film, talking aslant in a sense and not direct.
When I was thinking of the film, I didn't want it to be actually a film that is, in that sense, a personal film. It's not. I mean, using my story as a way in which to talk about something else, talking about architecture itself and the way that architecture, and in this case, the architecture is not only the architecture that Charles himself designed, but it's architecture as a sense of, as a metaphor, actually, of a sense of knowing. Or being. Architecture is something that makes sense of chaos, right? And that kind of idea of an architecture as identity, in some sense, of the self, the nation, as well as the building itself, was something that I was really interested in kind of exploring, right? And the fact that that architecture is always some sort of apparition or some sort of ideal that we are always performing ourselves to try and become. There's a certain kind of imagination of the nuclear family and a certain imagination of the man, his role within it. That is part of the architecture in some sense of society, and our kind of the architecture that is designed in the built form is always very often for that particular imagination. But our lives, of course, are never fit very neatly into that kind of slot. So actually, the film actually is in some sense an exploration of that gap that exists between this perfection of architecture and the impossibility of it as well. I mean, in that sense. So when I was thinking of the kind of writing the script, we thought of like three kinds of registers in which the text can kind of actually work. Actually, four to some extent. The first is the register of the kind of large political, historical, conceptual things, the description of the architecture, a road encircles a hill covered with mango trees and all of that stuff. The second is this sort of voice, which is, the first voice is largely in Mukul's voice, the conceptual voice, and sometimes even the descriptive voice. The second voice is again usually in sonals, which my sister and my voices, which is we alternate between them, which is the voice of I guess nostalgia. So it's this sort of those are the times of Russian ballet dancers, and the music in the background and all of that stuff kind of gives that sort of turn to it, including some of the film's division footage. So there's a certain kind of evocation of a certain time in a soft focus sort of way. And then there is the third, which actually begins with the riots after Amjad and Zubair come and live in my house, and the 92-93 riots become part of the story, where the voice starts turning more jagged, if you want to call it that way, is that my sonal and my voices start rubbing off each other. I complete sometimes what she says. Sometimes it's actually the place where language itself begins to disintegrate, because language can no longer describe things in some sense, and the architecture of language, in other words, is also begins to, in some sense, disintegrate. And that's the primitive hut sequence. The primitive hut, by the way, is an architectural reference, which is the primitive hut is imagined as the first unit of architecture, the first place that the shelter is born is in the primitive hut.
I see.
So that's why that image comes at the end.
Mukul, would you like to also respond to that question about sort of making this choice of formally, not talking to people? And so, for example, when you mentioned that idea of, how the space was meant to designed to be able to create that interaction and diversity of residents, but you're just mentioning that in the voiceover, and there are no accounts in that sense of lived experience of that. So why those choices?
Yeah, I mean, the film became, as we progressed, as we were shooting, we wanted to cover different seasons. We managed to cover most. We didn't get very heavy rain. But apart from that, we did consider shooting different housing typologies and so on. But finally, we stayed with Rohan's house, because talking about that entire personal experience, we made it more and more intimate, looking at his family and his family's story. And that becoming emblematic of everything else.
To some extent, it was a choice also made because we wanted that questions of metonymic relationship between family, home, nation, architecture to kind of work. And so it really wasn't about showing how other people are living. It was more about that imagination of the nuclear unit and the home as something that mirrors across different scales.
How Korea imagined it, and then how.
So that's actually where it emerged from.
Okay, so let's open it out. Yes, Faisal.
How much did you script before you started, Rohan? And how much did the process of just shooting change even what you were saying? And where did you start? I mean, what was the first set of things that you all shot?
So we had decided to shoot across the entire kind of year, which meant that the footage would then be collected across the entire and then would be structured later. However, the schedule of that the producers had did not allow for that to happen. So we had gotten until something like, I believe, December. Yes, December, when a script was demanded, and I panicked because script कुछ तो था नहीं, कुछ footage लिया था यहाँ. So at which point actually we scripted. I scripted the idea of the like polyphone, like the many voices came at that time, and the fact that each of them would be different registered came in at that time, and then there was lots of text that we had actually taken from the older brochures of LIC as well. Those were also part of the film, but we rejected that finally at the end of it because they have these amazing brochures that you see some of. So the script was written pretty much very, very quickly. It was written over 2 days, I think, the entire script. But the script did not have the end, the primitive hut end. It didn't have. The film seemed incomplete. I mean, then actually what happened is that Mukul cut a rough cut of the film, which we sent to PSBT, and they were fine with, but we weren't particularly happy with it. There was something, well, it wasn't working. At which point I remember that I think we had that text I had written was for some other purpose actually, that the primitive hut text is much longer. I had written it actually because I think I saw the ghost of my father a week after he had died. So it was written as a completely separate thing, right? It had no real relationship with the film. But I felt, by that time, I think I had enough distance from that text and that event for me to think that it could be a useful thing to think about when you're talking about the architecture of identity. So what happened is that then I showed it around to saying whether this will work as text. It seemed like a lot of people thought it might. So I said, okay, let's try it out and see whether it will. So we then kind of did this. And then Mukul did a second edit of it. We were still not very happy with it, actually, to be honest. And then we got Rikhav in. And then Rikhav actually, the final cut that you're seeing is actually Rikhav's. The last, the Buster Keaton sequence. The Buster Keaton sequence was something that actually one day in the morning we were thinking that Mukul and I curate for a space in Bombay. It's the Bhavdaji Art Museum. We screen films every month. So Mukul suggested that maybe one day we should be showing Buster Keaton. And I was like, actually Buster Keaton is the perfect end for the film. Because in Buster Keaton's work, very often what he's doing is that he's playing with his own body. And it's and the incongruity of architecture and its relationship with bodies, and the fact that there's this perpetual tension between them. He's always using architecture as a prop. So I felt that was really what the end was. And then we found this film, which was called 1 Week. It's fantastic.
It's a very moving little sequence.
Yeah, it's actually played for comedy in the film. In the original, we just turned it a little
It's a 20-minute film, and 100 years old, completely out of copyright, and it's on YouTube.
He's saying so. Yeah, just making sure he says so. So then we used that at the end. So the film was structured actually, in some sense, in that way.
And the shooting also, we started with the yellow flowers. So a lot of it shot really for the atmos, and for these very close, intimate kind of ways of recording this space that I have known for close to 20 years, and that his entire family has lived in for 40 years or so. Yellow flowers, red flowers, rain, and so on and so forth, until we started shooting more for the script, interiors, exterior, Diwali, and so on. And finding those boys with that colored smoke was just
I wanted to actually ask you about the colored smoke, but I think Paro has a question, so we'll come.
There's a line in the film where you say, the ideal life, I thought the ideal life was a life that I had led, and you kind of leave that idea undetailed in a way, but I wonder if you would talk about that a bit. So, like, what do you feel about that ideal life now?
Yeah. So when I was studying I studied architecture from 89 to 94. So it's like that transition. I was in the third year when the Ayodhya happened, for example, right? And it's also the time that liberalization happened and we got Channel V at home. So it was MTV at that time. So my entire kind of first 20 years of my education had a certain kind of idea about what architecture's role or what our role was supposed to be as middle class citizens. And I was living in a place that seemed fine, because in a sense they were like, because of the way that the houses were given, because you were not given a house based on your caste, class, or anything. You were given a house based on the policy you bought, really. And you had lots of different people buying these policies. So in the building, the 16 flats in my building, we had a Sikh family, a Muslim family, a Christian family. We had a Dalit family. We had a guy who was a peon in Churchgate, and we had a guy who had a business of, so it was like it was in that sense. And that was the reality that I presumed because I was growing up there. That was what it was. There was a particular also way in which nature and our relationship with nature was imagined. It was not, it was not lawns, it wasn't a kind of garden. It was like a forest. I mean, like, yahan wahan kuch. It was dhila. There was everything wasn't stitched up tight, which meant that lines were perpetually being blurred. Between private and public. In fact, many people really dislike those housing colonies because they don't provide you any privacy. Because imaginations of privacy itself are kind of strange. Because literally, there's a room in the flat that that my mother continues to live in now. There's an entire wall that's made completely of grills, which means that actually you can never close the house from nature. It's impossible. Which is not designed that way. Right? So it seemed natural to me. That way of kind of growing up. It was only after the 90s and actually the way that the entire it's strange that I was in architecture school in that transition period, but the idea of the ideal life itself transformed so radically after that. That even now I find it sometimes amazing that those kinds of spaces exist. Today, my relationship with it is I just find it like an oddity. It's a very odd place, don't know who could have commissioned it.
So has the space also changed?
Yes, it has. Like I point to it, what has happened is, of course, there's been more middle classization, and with the middle classes, their obsessions start coming in, which is more area chahiye. So a lot of the terraces have been enclosed. Some of the forest has become their private back gardens. You also have the forest that has now become a BMC park, which means now there's a gate that says that you can come in at this time, you can't come in at other times. But luckily, because it's a forest, it's very difficult to police. Because it's leaky still. They've tried to put a compound wall, but that just makes it worse because compound walls have gaps that become even more interesting places. So it's actually a place which a lot of lovers come to at night. They hang around various corners doing, wonderful things that incenses some of our middle class neighbors who say kya hota hai ye ladke ladki aate hain apne motorcycle par, but really there's nothing they can do about it because karenge to kya karenge, they can't light up the forest, so it's still a little like in that space right now.
Okay, so while they think up more questions, tell us about the colored smoke.
Yeah, so meaning we were shooting the forest, as he said, and we saw these boys with these colored smoke bombs taking pictures on a DSLR to put on Instagram. Okay, so all of this is happening, all this performance is happening, and we're like, oh my God. And other people asked if we set it up, and we're like, not quite, but yeah, you end up shooting it or cutting it like fiction, like you have set it up. And then, so there's all that performance and all that performance of identity and masculinity, which is happening at that point of time. Which we document. It's around the time of Diwali, and which then intercuts with Rohan, in his room with his entire wall full of pop star.
I was a Madonna fan. I had Madonna everywhere.
Yeah,
I wanted to be her.
So that's Rohan's Instagram moment.
No, but I really felt like that was, I was really happy that happened while we were shooting because for me, it became a way in which you can encapsulate this idea of the mirror and that the ideal always exists on the other side of the mirror. And then on this side, you're always perpetually trying to become that person you want to be. But as you're becoming that person itself is moving away and you're then perpetually in a kind of state of performance. And creation and recreation of identities. And I think that end sequence of Buster Keaton also in that sense was about that, the destruction and the perpetual need to, like, you can't live without architecture, but you also have to understand the limitations of architecture itself.
Faisal again.
There's somebody else. Go ahead. So, how does your living space now relate to where you grew up?
It's a very strange. I live in kind of a high-rise apartment building now. Really, I don't know my neighbors. I mean, it's just not. It's not that kind of place anymore. I mean, I guess because also I've changed. I'm a much older person. When you're a kid and you're doing things with your kids, you need to do things with your neighbors, so you make community. But since I don't have kids and we live in this sort of high-rise apartment building, I actually don't have any relationship with anyone except my car that's in the parking. Sometimes I go down for a swim, but that's it. It's a very strange sort of thing. The only thing in the house that I lived in, which you saw also in the film, in the living room, because actually I don't take you even into the bedrooms in the film. It's actually only the living room I allow you in. We had this perpetually changing furniture, but it was always on the floor. It was always like sab log gadde par baithe hain, and because that house you cannot do furniture for. My room has 3 doors, right? The living room has a big door that comes out onto the terrace, and on the other side there are 3 doors. So actually there's no corner upon which you can kind of put a sofa set in the conventional sense at all. So what we had to do is we just had to kind of put a gadda on the ground, and that was where you sat and you did your things. And so even in the new home, we've tried to kind of recreate that sense of like niche. I'm very comfortable with kind of sitting below. Sofas I'm not yet gotten used to.
So you have carried the architecture.
To some extent, it stays with you. It's difficult actually, but it happens even when I teach architecture at an architecture college in Bombay. And I find myself perpetually thinking about where you go. I mean, it's part of your memory, right? It becomes the sort of value system through which you begin to talk about things. And I think that value system is actually what I get most maybe. That complicates matters when you're teaching kids of today, because really they don't understand what it means at all. It's not a world that they've ever imagined. So to kind of start. And I continue to feel, and maybe I'm old-fashioned now, but there's a great value in some of those ideas that shaped that architecture, whether that was the fact that all these different kind of religions could live in one space, or there was a lovely kind of way in which the hierarchy of spaces happened, the softness of edges. Those were all incredibly powerful as things that I think really shapes what I think is good architecture that we should be living in.
As opposed to gated communities.
And this perpetually sort of separation or rather I would say the suspicion of the public as something that is fundamentally in some sense that's going to pollute your purity. And that seems to be this kind of strain that is almost all architecture seems to be perpetually kind of working with. I mean, if you look at the kind of developer advertising that you find in Bombay, it seems as if they're advertising a jail. They have CCTV cameras, they have, boom barriers, they have, I mean, I find it totally kind of odd. There's a question there.
I saw a little autobiography in the architecture as autobiography bit, and so I did, of course, apart from the death of your father that you meditated upon, and I was wondering that whenever the use of words like we and us came in the narrative, did you ever feel the need to pronounce the we and us a little more specifically to underline the autobiography part? Or whether you wanted to denote that as the public, like you said, as the public who lived there?
I think I wanted it to be a little more broader, right? So the we and us was in some sense kept. I mean, when I'm showing my grandfather, it's my grandfather, but it's also in some sense, to some extent, it's the way fiction works, no? Like you bring your own life into the film that you're watching because it's something so it works in that way. So although it was meant to be personal, it was also meant to some sense be universal. So I don't think there was a kind of question there.
No more questions?
Hello, sir. What I found most interesting for me as a filmmaker from this film was how you can connect architecture to meaning in your own personal life. And I remember Mukul sir teaching us in class about image making, and when you connect them with other images, they can form a completely different meaning. And to me, this film was a lot about architecture as therapy in a certain sense. Also, because the structure that you've brought upon is that you go from outwards to inwards. Like you start with the island, and you go deeper and deeper, and you go more personal as the film goes on, and you connect with kind of like it's a stream of consciousness. There's no like there's a pattern to it, which there's a sustained pattern, but like it's going more and more inward. And I felt that the connection that our architecture has with us is also with itself, in a sense that like that ecologically and physically structures degrade, right, with time, and our relationship with that also changes with time. So I mean, can you comment on the structure as to how you found this way as to go from the outer to the inner as the film goes on?
Maybe it's an architectural thing, pehle side plan dikhao. Uske baad, there seems to be a sort of way in which I guess so. Now that you're mentioning it, I'm thinking of it, but otherwise not something that was very conscious in my head. One of the things that we were playing, the subtitle, architecture as autobiography. It was something that I find it interesting because I find sometimes if I think about architecture as a sense of order and chaos, and not so much only the building, then sometimes even the writing of an autobiography is architecture, because in some sense you're making sense of a life that is much more complicated than that. Right. So the title could have been inverted as well. It could have been autobiography as architecture too. I mean, it was interchangeable.
No, and in that sense, also film also has its architecture, no? That structure that you have to work at. Sometimes you're excavating it from the material, and sometimes you're creating it from the outside in.
That he would be able to talk about better, actually.
So I think that's it.
Yeah, but before we end, I want to acknowledge Sabri Pandian, because Sabri has been absolutely invaluable for the 4 years that we worked together in every department, from direction to camera to production to scanning all the photographs and restoring them and so on and so forth. Thank you, Sabri.